the forgotten sixth founding father, the man who saved the American Revolution. Did you know that America's fight for independence wasn't shaped by just 5 founding fathers? There was actually a sixth man, a brilliant mind, a hidden hero, whose name mysteriously vanished from most American history books. A man who risked everything, from espionage to political betrayal, to keep the revolution alive when it was moments away from collapse. Today we uncover the untold story of the man who truly saved the American Revolution. Welcome to Untold Golden History. In this episode, we reveal the story of a forgotten patriot, the man erased by time. His name was John Laurens. Section 1. The Hidden Architect. John Laurens was not the sort of figure who fit neatly into the tidy chapters of school books. There's no marble statue in the Capitol Square bearing his name. There are no long columns of speeches, no political office where his portrait hangs. And yet, for the short, blindingly intense years he lived, Laurens moved through war rooms and salons, battlefields and drawing rooms, as a kind of human fuse, bright, volatile, and dangerously combustible. He burned hotter and faster than most men of his generation, and his flame, for a time, helped light the path that led to American independence. To understand Laurens, you have to begin with a contrast, a privileged upbringing, and an impatient radicalism. He was born into a wealthy South Carolina family whose name already carried weight in the mercantile and planter world of the colonies. Comfort, education, and social connections were all part of his inheritance. But from an early age, he resisted the complacency that often accompanied wealth. He was restless, impatient, the kind of young man who read, argued, and leapt into action instead of politely waiting for old men to solve new problems. Laurens's education sharpened both his intellect and his sense of urgency. He absorbed the classical texts, the new Republican thinking, the Enlightenment arguments on liberty and natural rights. But Laurens was not a theorist who kept his ideas on paper. He wanted them tried, tested, and put into practice. This is why, even before the war began in earnest, he was described by acquaintances as a man of rash courage and unquiet principles. Those phrases spoken by contemporaries are not insults. They were observations about a man who refused to let principle simmer politely in conversation when it could be turned into policy or action. That tendency would make him indispensable, and occasionally exasperating to men like George Washington. Laurens's relationships with Washington and with other prominent figures of the era were complex and revealing. With Washington, Laurens combined the audacity of youth with a kind of personal loyalty that Washington, a man wary of unchecked zeal, found useful. Laurens served as an aide and intelligence officer, a role that required discretion and courage. The job of an aide-de-camp was equal parts organizer, liaison, and messenger. It required someone the commander-in-chief could trust to carry sensitive instructions, to interpret political nuance, and to step into dangerous circumstances when a mission demanded it. Laurens did these things with conviction. But Laurens's circle extended beyond military duty. He formed bonds with other young revolutionaries whose ideas were shaping the new nation. He admired men like Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin, not just for their intellect, but for their willingness to take the revolution's cause into international and administrative arenas. Laurens admired Franklin's talent for diplomacy and persuasion, and Hamilton's strategic mind. He learned from them, but never became a pale imitation. He was his own irrepressible voice. One of the most striking, and now historically poignant, Features of Lawrence's character was his moral imagination about slavery and liberty. He came from a slaveholding society, but his thinking on the subject reflected a blow against comfortable assumptions. Lawrence argued with both passion and practicality that the Revolution's claims for liberty were hollow if they did not address the enslaved population. He proposed bold, controversial measures: the recruitment of enslaved African Americans into the Continental forces with the promise of freedom in return for service. To some contemporaries, this seemed both radical and pragmatic. To others, it was intolerable. Either way, Lawrence was willing to take political risks for what he believed to be justice intertwined with military necessity. His drive to translate ideas into outcomes is what led Lawrence to cross oceans on missions that no one else seemed eager to accept. If you imagine how fragile the revolutionary cause was at certain moments, penniless congresses, armies shivering in tattered clothing, supply lines choked by a dominant British Navy, then you can see why Washington leaned on men who could operate across theaters of power. The war could not be won by the grind of battle alone. It required money, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. And that is where Lawrence's combination of aristocratic polish and evangelical fury proved valuable. His missions abroad were not ceremonial. They were hard, often humiliating negotiations with foreign elites who had their own calculations, and more often than not, reasons to doubt a ragtag revolution. Lawrence found himself in the salons and treasuries of Europe, pressing arguments that the new nation must exist, that sinking the American cause would ripple beyond the Atlantic. He used rhetoric shaped by Enlightenment ideals and sharpened by his own near-painful sense of urgency. More than once, his determination and eloquence turned a refusal into a concession, not because he simulated certainty, but because he embodied one. At the same time, Lawrence's temperament gave him a different kind of operational advantage. He could be unpredictable. While some diplomats relied on polished manners and slow persuasion, Lawrence could cut through sugar-coated deference with blunt truths. Where that angered some courtiers, it impressed others who admired authenticity. His letters from Europe were not mere dispatches. They were urgent pleas and strategic manifestos. He described conditions bluntly, cataloged needs with a soldier's eye for logistics, and then added an incandescent moral frame that made his reports compelling to the sympathetic and infuriating to the skeptical. Back home, Lawrence's absence from the battlefield was sometimes misread as absence of courage, but he balanced the diplomatic with direct military engagement. He did not wait behind the lines while others bled. His hand in reconnaissance, skirmishing, and intelligence work showed that he was comfortable risking his life on both political and martial fronts. One reason Washington entrusted Lawrence with sensitive missions was that he could operate in the perilous seam between diplomacy and covert action, delivering messages under cover, arranging clandestine procurement, cultivating allies whose names never make it into formal roles. Lawrence's short life compressed an extraordinary density of experience. The intensity of frontline command, the solitude of missions in foreign courts, and the intellectual labor of shaping arguments about what a republic should be. He wasn't merely a soldier or a diplomat. He was a translator, someone who translated lofty ideals into the messy language of logistics, credit, and alliances. That talent for translation, both rhetorical and practical, is what made him so valuable during the Revolution's most perilous years. But translation is also an inherently vulnerable role. Those who operate between worlds often lack the institutional public platform that embeds someone in national memory. Washington became a general and then president.
Franklin became an emissary and a celebrity of Enlightenment diplomacy. Jefferson authored documents that would be read generation after generation. Lawrence performed crucial work that other men could claim, package, and publicize later. He also died young, and history, for all its effort to be comprehensive, sometimes discards those whose stories cannot be easily compiled into long post-war careers. Even so, traces of Lawrence's influence endure in private letters, in the testimonies of fellow officers, and in the fracture lines of political decisions that allowed the revolution to keep breathing until it could be won.
Section 2. The Mission That Defined History. John Lawrence's defining mission did not begin with fanfare. It began with desperation. By late 1779, the American Revolution was no longer a romantic uprising. It was a bleeding, starving, gasping struggle held together only by the stubborn will of its leaders. The optimistic fire of 1776 had cooled into something harsher: mud, hunger, frostbite, debt, and a Congress that could barely keep ink and paper supplied, let alone fund an army. The Continental Army's situation was not merely difficult, it was catastrophic. Soldiers marched barefoot on frozen ground, their feet wrapped in rags. Muskets were failing from lack of maintenance, powder barrels ran low, and uniforms were more patches than cloth. Officers wrote home describing lines of men who fainted during drills because hunger hollowed them from within. Desertion grew not from cowardice, but from human survival. Washington knew the truth. Without foreign aid, the revolution would die. For years, France had been America's lifeline, sending money, arms, uniforms, and ships. But now France hesitated. The war in Europe was straining its treasury. The French court was divided. Enlightenment thinkers adored the American cause, but ministers of finance saw a black hole of debt. The precarious alliance was on the verge of collapsing. So Congress, for once in its fractious existence, agreed on a single decision. A special envoy must be sent to France. Someone young, forceful, principled, persuasive, someone who could push past diplomatic resistance. And Washington knew exactly who that was. He sent for John Lawrence. A hot-headed warrior becomes a diplomat. If anyone doubted Washington's choice, it was because Lawrence had a reputation for being blunt, painfully blunt. Diplomacy, in theory, demanded charm, patience, and polite evasion. Lawrence had never been known for those qualities. His letters were direct, sharp, and scalding. He had once argued with Congress itself with a level of honesty that would have ruined most men's careers. But Washington understood something others did not. John Lawrence's intensity was not a flaw, it was a weapon. Europe's courts, filled with titles and gestures and powdered aristocrats, respected conviction when it came wrapped in sincerity. Lawrence did not flatter. He did not speak in riddles. He told the truth with the urgency of someone fighting a war with empty hands and dying comrades. He left for France in early 1781. The voyage was perilous. British ships patrolled the Atlantic, eager to intercept any American envoys. If Lawrence were captured, he would be a prize, a high-ranking officer, diplomat, and known critic of British rule. But he boarded the ship anyway, carrying Washington's final plea: do not return without what we need. Arrival in France, a political storm. Paris in 1781 was a dazzling contradiction. Elegant salons overflowed with literature, philosophy, and fine wine, while behind the walls of government offices, debts mounted like storm clouds. Lawrence walked into both worlds. Benjamin Franklin was already stationed there as America's chief diplomat. His age, charm, wit, and almost mythical reputation made him adored in Paris. But even Franklin, brilliant, strategic Franklin, was exhausted. He had spent years negotiating and persuading. The French ministers simply had no more money to give. So when Laurens arrived, he frankly greeted him, but with an unspoken warning: "This will not be easy." Laurens understood perfectly, but not easy was something he'd been raised to confront head-on. The meetings began. The first round of negotiations were icy. French ministers questioned everything: America's stability, Congress's dysfunction, Washington's dwindling forces, the practicality of sending more ships, whether the revolution could survive long enough to justify more investment. Laurens listened. Then he responded with a ferocity the French court had rarely witnessed from a diplomat. He described starving men in winter camps, the courage of farmers turned soldiers, the brutality of British reprisals, and the moral necessity of finishing what France had helped begin. When one official politely questioned whether the American cause could endure, Laurens leaned forward and replied, "We endure because we must. We endure because liberty has no retreat." The room fell silent. For weeks, Laurens met ministers, generals, financiers, naval strategists. He carried Washington's letters, maps, requisition lists, and a determination bordering on obsession. At times, he clashed with French officials so sharply that Franklin himself had to smooth things over. But Franklin also admired him. In a letter back to America, Franklin wrote, "Laurens has great fire, and though it sometimes burns too brightly, it warms where my old age cannot." The turning point came. When Laurens was granted an audience with King Louis XVI's closest advisors and key treasury officials, Laurens presented the state of the war with brutal honesty. America was out of money. The army was on the brink of starvation, but the people still believed in victory if France stood beside them. He ended with a sentence that struck through the diplomatic fog like lightning: "If America falls, liberty falls with it, and tyranny gains a victory that will echo across your own kingdoms." Those words traveled. They reached the king. They reached the Minister of Finance. They ignited a debate inside Versailles that stretched late into the night. And then, finally, France relented. The French agreement. France agreed to send 12 million livres in silver, tons of muskets, rifles, bayonets, and powder barrels, uniforms, tents, boots, blankets, artillery pieces, and engineering equipment, a fleet of warships to reinforce Washington's blockade plans. It was the largest single aid package France had ever approved for America. It was the lifeline Washington needed. Laurens had done it. A mission sealed by honor. When Laurens prepared to leave France, many were shocked he had succeeded. Parisian newspapers quietly praised the young American envoy with the spirit of a general. Franklin, with a proud smile, admitted, "Without Mr. Laurens, I fear these negotiations would have failed." As Laurens boarded the ship home, he was not thinking of praise. He was thinking of the soldiers who would finally receive boots, blankets, ammunition, and hope. For he knew this aid would decide the next chapter of the war. He was carrying the revolution's heartbeat back across the Atlantic, and history would soon prove him right.
Section 3. The French Gamble. The French gamble did not arrive as a single dramatic proclamation. It was a long, tense calculus played out in salons and treasuries, in private letters and midnight conferences. It was chess, where each move carried the fate of an ocean-spanning conflict. For John Laurens and the fragile American cause, the gamble was simple and terrifying. Would France commit the ships, money, and men necessary to turn a colonial rebellion into an international war of empires?
If France said no, the revolution might wither. If France said yes, the British would escalate and the contest would become global. The heart of that decision lived inside Versailles, inside a court that glittered with powdered wigs and embroidered waistcoats, yet trembled under debts, political anxieties, and the memory of its own revolution in the making. King Louis XVI and his ministers balanced personal honor, national pride, and fiscal reality. They had reasons both diplomatic and selfish to aid America, to wound Britain, to restore French prestige, to export revolutionary ideas, or to profit. Yet their treasury was not an endless well. Finance ministers counted livres late into the night and argued that French coffers might not survive an extended war. Into this world stepped John Laurens, young, brash, and incandescent with conviction. He had been sent not merely to plead, but to alter minds. He arrived under the patronage of Washington's name and with Benjamin Franklin's fragile authority behind him. But the real task was to tip a skewed political balance inside the French court. It was a mission that required more than eloquence. It required psychological precision, moral theater, and the capacity to exploit both sympathy and selfish national interest. A salon of size and calculations. Parisian salons were arenas of influence. Women and men of letters shaped opinions over tea and music as surely as diplomats at cabinet tables. Laurens spent long afternoons in salons where the rhetoric of liberty was common currency, but money was not. He listened to arguments from philosophers waxing on the rights of man, to nobles quietly considering the price of a war with Britain. Laurens knew how to use both. He framed the American struggle not merely as ideological theater, but as a geopolitical opportunity. Help the colonies and you cripple Britain's mercantile dominance. Help the colonies and France could expand its influence over the Atlantic. But salons were not enough. The decision-makers wore different coats. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, was a man of slow temper and long memory. Vergennes had eyed Britain for years and saw an American alliance as a strategic dagger. But the Minister of Finance, Jean-François Joly, or others in similar posts over that period, took a sterner view. The coffers were drained after previous conflicts. The more radical elements in French society were restless. Open war could set a precedent that brought instability home. Laurens had to navigate both personalities. He wrote letters in a careful mixture of urgency and flatteries, tailored to French courtly taste. He used Franklin's name like a key, and Franklin in turn arranged private introductions and lent Laurens a social legitimacy that a young American envoy otherwise lacked. But Franklin's charisma alone could not overcome the ledger books. The real persuasion needed to come through narrative, the image of French glory restored, of British arrogance humbled, and a future trade unlocked. The Treasury's cold calculus. Several scenes stand out in the negotiations, small moments of friction that reveal the enormity of the stakes. One evening, in a candlelit council room, a minister spread a ledger across the table and pushed it toward Laurens. "You ask us for money to supply an army halfway across the sea. We have our own debts. Our people starve. How do you propose France bears the cost without bankruptcy?" Laurens could have answered with rhetoric. Instead, he unfolded a map showing how French trade would expand if Britain's Atlantic chokehold would broken. He spoke of ports and markets, of sugar and timber, of the long-term commercial balance that would favor France. He spoke not as an idealist, but as a merchant who had climbed the mast and seen the advantages of open seas. And then he did something else. He told them stories,
careful human stories of American soldiers who froze without blankets, of wives whose pensions never arrived, of small towns that thought independence a romantic idea until a winter of rags made it a near tragedy. He described Washington's endurance not as a force of will alone, but as a moral magnet that might pull Europe toward different alliances. It was an appeal to both heart and calculation. The minister sighed. "He speaks well," he said finally, "but speech alone does not refill vaults." At the edge of the table, Franklin tapped the ledger with a thin finger and reminded them of France's own strategic advantage. He spoke in soft phrases, a practiced balm between Lawrence's urgency and the minister's caution. Franklin suggested structured loans, repayable funds that allowed France influence without immediate ruin. What France needed was leverage, not an open-ended charity. What Lawrence had to do now was secure both French ships, arms, and a loan large enough to stabilize American credit. It meant convincing thromboned bureaucrats to accept complex arrangements and persuading military leaders that victory in America could be financed and supported. It meant beating back British diplomats who whispered in corridors and bought favors. The French gamble was not simply about money, it was about risk allocation. Who would accept early losses for later strategic gain?
Section 4. The Final Sacrifice. The Shadow over Victory. Yorktown was won, but peace was not yet signed. In late 1781 and early 1782, America celebrated the victory at Yorktown as if the war were over. Cities rang with bells, taverns overflowed with speeches, and Congress declared days of thanksgiving. Washington, always restrained, wrote careful letters urging the nation not to relax too quickly. But no one understood the truth, the real truth, more acutely than John Lawrence. The British still held New York. The British still held Charleston, his home. The British Navy still commanded the Atlantic, and a single bad turn in diplomacy could still collapse everything. Lawrence knew that victory was fragile, and he knew something else. He had unfinished business. Not political, not diplomatic, personal, moral, historical. For years he had fought Congress to create a black regiment, a force of enslaved men who would earn freedom through service. His proposal had been bold, revolutionary, and ahead of its time. Washington supported it quietly. Hamilton supported it passionately. But Congress had buried it. Southern delegates refused to allow it. South Carolina ignored him. Georgia mocked him. And yet Lawrence would not let it go. Freeing slaves through military service had become his life's passion, equal to, if not greater than, defeating the British. No American officer of his era spoke so fiercely, so consistently, so dangerously about emancipation. But now, in 1782, with the war drawing to a close, he knew it was his last chance to prove that enslaved men could fight for a free America. A home returned, a home in ruins. In April 1782, Lawrence received orders, and he did not hesitate. He would return to South Carolina, to his own people, to his own land, to the place that rejected him most fiercely. But Charleston was not the city he had left. It was starved, broken, occupied. British patrols walked the streets. Families lived in fear, plantations burned, fields abandoned, and enslaved people suffered doubly, under war and under bondage. Lawrence saw his home for what it truly was, a battlefield of morality.
He rode past estates where enslaved men who had once heard whispers of freedom now labored with heavier chains. He passed burned huts, destroyed rice fields, the remnants of raids that left families scattered and hungry. And as he rode, he made himself a promise. If I die fighting for anything, let it be for their freedom as much as mine. Resisting surrender. South Carolina's leaders were exhausted, desperate to negotiate, eager to reclaim their plantations. They wanted to end the war cleanly, meaning restoring slavery exactly as it had been before. To them, Laurens was inconvenient, a radical, a man who disrupted old systems. He saw it immediately. They wanted the British out. They wanted the economy restored. But they did not want emancipation. One delegate told Laurens to his face, "We have fought the British, not our own institutions." Laurens replied with the fury of someone who had carried this fight for years. "Then what liberty have we claimed if men remain slaves under our flag?" He fought them in meeting halls, he fought them in letters, he fought them in public debates. He fought them until he made enemies of nearly every politician in Charleston. But he refused to yield. The final mission. By mid-1782, skirmishes still erupted throughout South Carolina. British forces, cornered but dangerous, launched raids to secure supplies. American detachments were stretched thin. Laurens volunteered for everything: scouting, intercepting messengers, pursuing British foraging groups. Washington sent him a letter urging caution. Hamilton wrote begging him to avoid unnecessary danger. Even Henry Laurens, broken from years in the Tower of London, wrote warnings. "Do not risk your life now, John. The peace will be signed soon." But Laurens' reply was blunt, honest, and haunting. "My dear father, I cannot be idle until liberty is secured, indeed, not just in word." August 27, 1782. On a humid summer morning near the Combahee River, Laurens received intelligence of a British raiding party moving toward a rice plantation. He did not wait. He did not gather a committee. He did not ask command for permission. He mounted his horse, rallied a small company of troops, and rode. This was typical Laurens, immediate, instinctive, courageous. But this time, fate waited for him. The last charge. The sun had barely climbed the horizon when Laurens approached the British position. The marshland shimmered with heat. Tall grass hid the enemy's movements. Gunpowder hung heavy in the air. His officers begged him to fall back and wait for reinforcements. Laurens refused. He ordered the troops forward. Then, before anyone could stop him, he spurred his horse straight toward the enemy line. It was reckless, heroic, pure Laurens. British skirmishers hid in the grass, opened fire. A volley cracked across the marsh. Laurens fell from his saddle instantly. The men ran to him. He was still breathing, barely. Blood darkened his uniform. His hand trembled at his side. Witnesses later wrote there was a strange peace on his face, as if he had already known this moment was coming. Some swore he whispered something as he died, a single word they could not fully hear. Others believed they heard it clearly. Liberty. It was over. The news that broke Washington. When Washington received news of Laurens' death, he did not respond immediately. It was the only time, the only recorded time that Washington was unable to write back for days. When he finally did, His letter said, "I feel the deepest sorrow at the loss of an officer of so great merit. I had conceived the highest hopes of the public's future advantage from the continuation of his services." Hamilton broke down when he heard the news. He wrote a devastating line, "I wept for him as I have never wept for any man." The war would continue a short time longer. The treaty would soon be signed. America would become a nation. But John Laurens, the young man who had fought for liberty, diplomacy, justice, and emancipation, would not live to see a single day of the country he helped build. The tragedy of a dreamer. Laurens did not die as a general. He did not die in a grand battle. He died in a small skirmish no textbook mentions. Not from incompetence, but from conviction. He died because he believed the fight was not finished. He died because he would not watch others suffer while he stayed safe. He died because he believed freedom was not a slogan. It was a responsibility. His death was not the end of his ideas. It was the beginning of their echo.
Section 5. The legacy that was almost lost. A nation without its idealist. The Revolutionary War officially ended in 1783. America was free. Washington was celebrated as a hero. Cities erupted with fireworks, parades, and speeches proclaiming a new age of liberty. But beneath the celebrations, a quiet grief lingered for those who did not live to see this moment. Among them, John Laurens was a name spoken in soft tones, too painful, too heavy, too tied to unfinished dreams. Washington mourned him privately. Hamilton mourned him with words he struggled to write. Henry Laurens mourned him with a broken father's silence. Yet, as the young nation took its first steps, Laurens's legacy was already slipping away. History, like politics, can be cruel. Heroes of inconvenient ideas are often forgotten first. The silence after the war. In the years immediately following independence, America faced enormous decisions. How to build a government, how to manage debt, how to unify 13 quarreling states, how to confront or avoid the question of slavery. And that last issue was the most dangerous of all. Southern delegates feared the economy would collapse without enslaved labor. Northern delegates feared that pressing too hard would tear the country apart before it even began. So they made a decision. They would postpone the conversation, delay justice, protect unity, maintain the system. And in that compromise, in that silence, John Laurens's most important belief died its first death. He had spent his life arguing that the new nation must reject slavery if it wished to call itself free. Now, after his death, his warnings were ignored. His proposals were shelved. His letters stored away. His reputation quietly simplified from John Laurens, the fighter for emancipation, to John Laurens, the brave officer who fell in South Carolina. They kept the hero. They buried the reformer. Hamilton's grief and his loneliness. Alexander Hamilton, carrying his own political rise, never stopped thinking about Laurens. To him, Laurens was more than a friend. He was the embodiment of the America Hamilton wanted. Bold, compassionate, principled, willing to challenge corruption and hypocrisy. He wrote of him, the one man who truly understood the cause of liberty in its fullest extent. But Hamilton also understood something else. Laurens's death left him alone in the fight against slavery. Without Laurens in Congress, without his fire, Without his uncompromising honesty, Hamilton found fewer allies. The battles Lawrence once fought, Hamilton now fought alone, often losing. Some historians believe Hamilton's later political bitterness came from this loneliness, the loneliness of knowing that the one man who shared his dream of a free and equal America had died too soon. The father's burden. Henry Lawrence, the once powerful diplomat who had survived imprisonment in the Tower of London, lived his final years with a wound no treaty could heal. He blamed himself, blamed the war, blamed fate. Before his death, Henry left a request in his will. "I desire that my body be burned, not buried." When he died in 1992, his body was cremated, one of the earliest recorded cremations in American history, and the ashes were scattered on his estate. Some believe he chose this because he wanted to lie nowhere that could remind him of John's grave. Some believe he wanted to erase pain. Others believe he wanted to symbolize a truth. From ashes, a free nation had risen, but at an unbearable cost. The legacy that refused to die. For decades after the Revolution, Lawrence's name faded from public memory. But ideas are stubborn, especially ideas born from conviction. And Lawrence's conviction that slavery and liberty could not coexist began to reappear in unexpected places. His letters circulated among abolitionists. His arguments appeared in early anti-slavery pamphlets. His proposals were studied by Northern activists who saw him as a martyr for a cause that America was not yet ready to face. By the 1830s, abolitionists began to quote him. By the 1850s, his writings resurfaced in newspapers debating the growing tension between North and South. By the Civil War, John Lawrence's dream had become the central question of the nation. And in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, one historian wrote, "This is the fulfillment of a prophecy spoken long ago by a young soldier who did not live to see his country free." The South Carolina irony. The most symbolic transformation came from the place Lawrence loved and fought so much. The state that rejected his ideas, silenced his proposals, and resisted his emancipation plan, became one of the first to honor his memory after the Civil War. Monuments were built, roads named after him. Students studied his bravery, and historians finally told the truth about his radical vision. The very soil that once denied him began to celebrate him. Time has a strange way of correcting injustice. The man America finally remembered. Today, John Lawrence is recognized not merely as a soldier, but as a fierce advocate for emancipation, a revolutionary thinker ahead of his time, a diplomat who secured the aid that won the war, a moral voice America desperately needed, a symbol of courage grounded in conviction, a reminder that liberty must be universal or it becomes hypocrisy. He represents the America that could have been sooner, and the America that eventually became. His life proves something rare. A hero is not the one who seeks glory, but the one who seeks justice, even when justice is centuries away. The last reflection. If John Lawrence had lived, he might have led the early abolitionist movement. He might have reshaped the South. He might have served in Washington's cabinet. He might have joined Hamilton in building a stronger, more moral nation. He might have accelerated America's path to freedom for all. But history chose a different path. And yet, his dreams survived him.
Freedom expanded because of people who read his letters, remembered his passion, and carried his mission forward. John Lawrence did not live to witness the country he helped create, but he helped shape the soul of the country America eventually became. And that is a legacy no battlefield bullet can erase. If you were inspired by the incredible story of John Lawrence, the forgotten sixth founding father, don't forget to like this video and share it with history lovers around the world. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from American history and hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Comment below, which hidden hero should we uncover next?